Welcome. I'm Jane Frances Kelly. I'm the director of the David Hume Institute. Welcome to Codebase. It's our first venue here. In fact, a couple of members said to me in the way, and it's the first time they had been out of the RSE. And so you guys are particularly welcome. Some of you may remember this building if you ever had to sign on, as for many years it was Edinburgh's main DHSS office. And in fact, they still have the safes that they had for all the money in their boardroom. And those safes will actually never leave the boardroom because they found that they had built the room around the safes. And you can't pick them up either, so they've painted them all different colours. So there's over 100 technology companies upstairs in various stages of development. And their alumni include the unicorns FanDuel and Skyscanner. And unicorns is one of those words that I dated the various different meanings that I learned of it quite recently. At the extreme other end of the spectrum, I did my first ever coding in here 3 weeks ago, when I was taught how to make the past event pages on the David Hume website look better. I did actual coding. I kind of went around and told everybody. I was so excited. This room that we're in was apparently a commercial garage back in the day. Somebody else was telling me. And now it's used for everything from after-school children's coding classes to the Traverse Theatre's spillover fringe program, in fact. I've also checked with a previous director of the Institute, and he confirms that it's the first David Hume Institute event he's aware of that has had fairy lights. A quick mention of upcoming events. The Politicians and Professionals series, when we'll hear from the leaders of each of Scotland's main political parties, is almost all scheduled now for January and February. We don't yet have a date for the Scottish Labour Party leader, but he was only elected at the weekend, and we are now on the case. Extremely impressively, we do, however, have a date for the First Minister, but we can't say what it is yet. And of course, it may not be the last date that we get. So as we're able, we'll be putting the dates up on the website over the next few days so you can start reserving places. And we'll also send out an email to the membership database next week. Other speakers lined up for next year include David Willits and Lord Kerr, so stay tuned. For this evening, we're delighted to have three guests who I'll now introduce. In the chair, we have Dame Mariot Leslie. Mariot joined the diplomatic service in 1977, and her overseas postings have included Singapore, Bonn, and Rome, as well as 2 years spent on secondment to the French Foreign Ministry in Paris. From 2002 to 6, she was British ambassador to Norway, and on returning from Oslo, she became the Foreign Secretary's Counter-Terrorism Envoy and Director of the Defence and Strategic Threats, going on to become Director General, Defence and, note self,
Intelligence.
Intelligence at the FCO in 2007, and a member of the UK's Joint Intelligence Committee. Her last post before retiring from the diplomatic service was UK Permanent Representative to NATO. And in mid-career, Mariot also spent 2 periods at the then Scottish office in Edinburgh, working on industrial development and economic policy, when I believe that you worked with our Chair of Trustees, John Elbridge. Professor Wyn Jones, on my left, joined the staff of Cardiff University in February 2009 as Director of the Wales Governance Centre. He's written extensively on contemporary Welsh politics, devolved politics in the UK, and nationalism, and was one of the founders of Critical Security Studies. Richard is a regular broadcaster, commentating on Welsh politics in both Welsh and English for the BBC in Wales and across the UK. He's also presented 2 TV series and used to be a drummer, so he knows how to use microphones better than me, and is a regular columnist for the Welsh language current affairs magazine. I didn't want to try and pronounce it. Professor Michael Keating is Director of the Centre on Constitutional Change, an inter-university consortium of researchers. He's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, of the British Academy, of the Academia Europaea, and of the Academy of Social Sciences, which is the kind of sentence in a curriculum vitae that you have to take a breath in the middle. Michael's research interests include comparative European politics, territorial politics, and nationalism. He speaks English, French, Spanish, and Italian, so I think we've got quite a lot of languages up there, so we'll just have to hope that they speak to us in English. I'll now hand over to Mariot to take us through how the evening will run, and we'll look forward to joining you for a drink afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Jane Frances. you really need to hear from me at this stage of the event, because as you hear, we've got two absolutely excellent speakers. So what I'm going to do is ask Paul Keating and then Richard Wynne-Jones to speak to us about 20 minutes each, and then I'll open it to questions. And if you get a bit stuck, I might wade it, but I don't expect you to get all. I will probably want to take questions 3 at a time, and then we'll divide them up and have another round. So that's what we're going to do. Michael, could you perhaps go first?
Yeah, I'll stand up so no teacher's reflex. I can shove this microphone under my chin like this. Not so you can hear me, because you could hear me anyway, but for the recording. Well, I'd like to thank the David Hinman Institute for inviting me here to talk about Brexit. I was talking about Brexit yesterday. I'm talking about Brexit on Thursday. I'm talking about Brexit on Friday, but I think tomorrow I'll probably have a day off talking about Brexit. And what we've been working on in the Centre on Constitutional Change is the impact of Brexit on the devolution settlement in the United Kingdom, and more generally on the constitutional order across these islands, including the border question in Ireland and the issue of the Republic of Ireland itself in relation to Brexit. And starting from a premise which people in London especially were not really conscious of in the start of this whole debate about the EU and Brexit, which is that the European Union and the European political order more generally, including the European Convention on Human Rights and the other institutions, are one of the few things that are keeping the United Kingdom together as a union, and generally speaking maintaining the broader constitutional settlement across the islands as it has evolved in the last 20 years since the devolution process started in Scotland and Wales and the peace process got off the ground in both parts of Ireland. Now, this is a paradox to some people from one perspective, because the whole idea of Brexit was to take back control, to restore parliamentary sovereignty on the assumption that the United Kingdom is a unitary state in which sovereignty is lodged in one place. Now, a funny thing happened, of course, in the process of the campaign and the interpretation of the result, which was that sovereignty suddenly shifted from Parliament to the British people. I'm not going to talk about that one, but it does have some relevance to our theme, and there had to be a judgment of the UK Supreme Court to point out that it was Parliament that was getting the sovereignty back, and there was not a direct link from the British populace to the royal prerogative, and things could then immediately happen. But that was the first constitutional challenge that Brexit posed. There will be many other such challenges. But there's a different way of looking at the British Constitution, and we've all been aware of this for a long time, but most of the time it hasn't really mattered, which is that the United Kingdom is a plurinational or a multinational union. There's not a single people or demos. There are different peoples. The meaning of nationality is different from one part of the United Kingdom to another. The understanding of what the union is very different. There's a tolerance of different identities, different constitutional understandings. The UK has no fixed endpoint. It has no mission statement. It's continually evolving, being renegotiated in every generation. And that in the last 20 years we've seen an intensification of that process with the renegotiation of the union with a highly asymmetrical devolution settlement, different arrangements in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Not yet for England, but Richard is looking at this, and when the English are going to get their constitutional act together, with no particular game plan, but in which we've been generally moving in a kind of federalizing direction. The UK is not a federation, but that is the direction of travel, and which increasingly it is recognized that this is a fixed part of the Constitution. This is not just an administrative reorganization. Devolution is based upon a rethinking of our constitutional order, but leaves in abeyance huge areas that are simply not addressed. Some people think that's a problem. Others think it's rather a healthy thing, not raising issues that you don't know the answers to. But such things as where does sovereignty lie? Does Scotland have a right to self-determination? Just left up in the air. And if we think of the United Kingdom that way, there's an extraordinarily good fit with the European Union. which is a plurinational union, in which you have multiple nationalities, in which you have a complicated constitutional order with no fixed endpoint, in which you have a lot of scope for adjustment, in which there is a supranational order, but at the same time recognition of national diversity within it. So, as a rather general level of analysis, you could say there's the idea that somehow there's a lack of fit between the UK constitution because we believe in parliamentary sovereignty and therefore we can't have supranational authority. It's really quite misleading. It's a profound misunderstanding of the way that our constitution works and has been developing and deepening since devolution in the late 1990s. Now, that raises some questions in particular. I'll just elaborate a little bit on how the European Union does that. The first is that the European Union is, we know, based upon the supersession of the idea of national sovereignty. Sovereignty in the European Union is shared at different levels. It is pooled in complicated ways. The nation states may pretend they're sovereign. They're not really sovereign. The European Union opens up borders. It doesn't abolish borders, but borders become less important. Now, this provides a kind of discursive space in which we can talk about transcending sovereignty, post-sovereignty, multiple levels of sovereignty. That's a kind of intellectual framework that's extremely useful for understanding the way the United Kingdom is going and gets us out of all kinds of zero-sum problems that otherwise would be present. The question of borders is absolutely critical, notably in relation to Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland peace process was not produced by the European Union, but that provided an essential context from it, because you can say the border is still in Northern Ireland, there will still be a border, but it will be penetrable. It will not be an economic border. You have a settlement in Northern Ireland in which people are invited to adopt multiple identities and any combination of identity they like and have a territorial expression of it. There are institutions that allow them to do this, and the European framework is absolutely critical. In another respect, the European framework has allowed a much more extensive devolution settlement within the United Kingdom than otherwise would have been possible. Some of us were around in the 1970s when there was an attempt at devolution there. Yes, we were in the European community. There wasn't a single market then, and the devolution settlement proposed there was much more restrictive than the one in 1998, 1999, because the European Union looks after all kinds of single market functions, all kinds of regulations, and so allows a much more expansive and open form of devolution, which develops over time. And then, really specifically, the European Union is responsible for particular kinds of competences. These are taken out of the national level and put to the European level. And then the element that I think is possibly most important, along with the market and economic element, is the notion of rights. Now, this is mostly to do with the European Convention on Human Rights. But we get our rights here directly from the European Convention of Rights, not from Westminster, although there's a lot of talk about a British Bill of Rights. That would be highly problematic if you had to be British here to get your rights. The European Convention is more neutral and therefore more acceptable to everybody. Take that to Northern Ireland, and that is true in spades, that you should be able to have rights not depending upon nationality. Now, there is an EU dimension to that too, because one of the things that Brexit will involve is getting out of the European Union Charter of Rights, which is another thing. There's been a big debate about that, and arguments in Scotland and Wales that maybe we shouldn't, but we don't have to get out of that as well. So the potential consequences of Brexit are enormous. What are the possibilities? Well, the possibilities are that the UK, following Brexit, could reconstitute itself as a unitary state. If it's bringing power back to Parliament or even this British people, unitary British people, that's a centralizing concept. And a lot of the dynamic of Brexit is precisely about that. Take back control to that one place. That's a possibility. Currently, there's an argument about a very technical, complicated business that gets to the heart of this issue of principle. And that is about the repatriation of competences, which means what happens to those European things that are devolved to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but also Europeanized. We're talking about fisheries, agriculture, environmental policy, some bits of justice and home affairs. Do they come back to Scotland or do they come back to Westminster? We're doing a lot of work about this at the moment. And as far as London is concerned, this is just a technical matter. It's a matter of convenience. And so the withdrawal bill says, we'll take him back to Westminster because it's handy, and then we'll decide what to give you afterwards, if there's any bits left over. They don't understand that that's a matter of principle. That following the Scottish referendum and the Smith Commission and all the rest, that there was a pledge by the Westminster parties that we will respect your devolution settlement. We will entrench it, and therefore we won't mess it about just because it happens to be convenient. So while there seems to be a minor issue about what you're going to do about modulation in agricultural policy or whatever, there's an issue of principle involved there, and other such issues will come up. Another possibility is, well, the United Kingdom could disintegrate. And immediately after the referendum result last year, this is the scenario people were talking about. Well, Scotland will become independent. Ireland will unify. Richard can say, well, what happened to Wales? They voted to leave, of course, which complicates the matter. So I'll just stick to the two bits that I deal with. But that's not an easy answer either. What happened when Scottish independence was put on the table? Well, yes, Scotland will stay in the European Union. We won't have a border with the EU 27, but we'll have a border with England instead. That doesn't solve the problem. That just moves the problem of the border. Similarly, with regard to Ireland, there are all kinds of ideas, border in the Irish Sea. I won't get into frictionless borders and non-physical borders and technological fixes because I don't think they address the problem at all. But you're going to have a border there. You're going to have new borders, whatever happens. Simply moving the border to another place doesn't solve the problem when the problem is borders. And the advantage of the European Union is you can deal with borders in a way you otherwise couldn't do. And the third possibility is maybe the United Kingdom is going to have to reconfigure itself faced with the challenge of Brexit. Maybe it will be possible, because we're already a very asymmetrical kind of quasi-federal system, maybe it would be possible to have differential arrangements with Europe in the different parts of the United Kingdom. Now, we know the UK government has struck that one down, but then the next moment they say, we'll do something for Northern Ireland. I have no idea what, but they say they will do something for Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland comes into the game there as well, because you can't do things for Northern Ireland without the consent of the government of the Republic of Ireland. That's part of the agreement. So we're going to get complicated reconfigurations around Northern Ireland. In the case of Scotland, maybe the first effort by the Scottish government to have a differential settlement was struck down, but the Scottish government, I understand, is going to have another go at that. But there's a tremendous resistance at the centre to allowing this. Now, when I sketched these possibilities out a few months ago, somebody said, you said there are three possibilities and they're all impossible, but one of them is going to happen. So the impossible is going to happen. And I said, in the last year, a lot of impossible things have happened in politics. So we'll just wait and see.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. It's always difficult following Michael because he speaks fluently without notes, which is annoying. And I tend not to get kind of tied into my notes, but I had to get up at 4:30 this morning to come and go and catch a plane to come up. So I've got some notes because I was worried that I'd kind of run out of steam halfway. So if I'm looking down, peering at my notes, please forgive me. I want to focus on something which I suspect most of you won't know much about, but which I suspect is actually quite important, which is the Welsh Government's position on Brexit and the way that it's changed since the referendum up until the present day. It's a kind of interesting story, at least for political anarchs, but also I think it's potentially consequential in terms of what's going to happen, especially around the withdrawal bill. Now, you will be aware, hopefully, that the Welsh Government is a Labour government, so the Labour in power. They've got the lone Liberal Democrat Assembly member and a renegade Plaid Cymru former leader who are propping them up. Both the ministers. The way to get ahead in Welsh politics is to actually go and prop up Labour, and they put you in the cabinet. It's a great career move. But what's interesting, we've got this Labour government in Wales working very, very closely now with the SNP-led government in Scotland in seeking fundamental changes to the withdrawal bill. And I think the fact that they're working together makes securing such changes more likely than would be the case otherwise, not least because the Welsh Government has a proven ability to mobilise the House of Lords in a way that I suspect that the Scottish Government in its current incarnation can't. So I think that the fact that they're working together in the House of Lords, and in particular, is important. Now, what's going on here? Well, anybody who's seen the two ministers working in tandem will have been impressed by the closeness and the ease of the working relationship now between Cardiff and Edinburgh. There's no precedent to the closeness of the relationship. And it clearly helps that Mike Russell and Mark Drakeford, the two ministers, are, some of the most intelligent and personable and least tribal members of both governments. So clearly they get on well, they work together very, very easily and straightforwardly. But also, the governments share a great deal of common ground in terms of their reading of the implications of what the UK government is trying to do with its legislative proposals. And they also share deep frustration at the way that the UK government has been failing, at least until very, very recently, to take their concerns seriously. So there's a lot of overlap between the positions of Edinburgh and Cardiff, but also some interesting distinction. So they're very, very close in terms of how they understand the implications of the withdrawal bill for devolution. They've got a different position on the UK's future relationship with the EU. So, and it's, teasing out the overlap and the differences is worthwhile. And in particular, it's worth saying that the Welsh Government continues to use ambiguous language about the future that they would like to see, the future relationship they would like to see between Wales and the UK and the European Union. So they talk about full and unfettered access to the single markets. That remains, which is the kind of language you hear from the Labour Party. I'll come back to that in a moment. They talk about the attractions of the Norway model, which they celebrate but never quite endorse. Okay, so there's some ambiguity about that. But in terms of their reading of the implications of the withdrawal bill for devolution that Michael has just been talking about, that you couldn't get a cigarette paper between them. So in terms of understanding what's going on in Wales and the Welsh Government's position, and the trajectory that they followed from a kind of disbelief and horror after the referendum result in Wales, because they were clearly surprised by the result in Wales, even though all our polling was suggesting that it was going to be incredibly close and possibly dipping in to leave in Wales. The Welsh Government was clearly very surprised and very depressed at the result. They now move to a position where they're putting joint amendments down with the Scottish Government. So there's been this big shift. So what are the forces acting upon them? Well, first of all, obviously, you've got the referendum results in Wales. And it's not just the fact that Wales voted leave, not by a big majority, but nonetheless voted leave. It's that the Labour heartlands voted leave. Now, and also, that was in the context of a UKIP breakthrough in the 2015 UK general election in Wales, and UKIP electing 7 members to the National Assembly for Wales in 2016. So, there was clearly deep, deep concern in the Labour Party. And it's not surprising that the Welsh Government will always preface anything it says about Brexit with saying that we must respect the results in Wales. So they're very clear about that. There's also no doubt, of course, and it's just worth saying this, that the fact that we had this result in Wales lessens the bargaining power of Cardiff in London. It's very, very easy for London to turn around and say, well, you voted for that. And Wales finds it more difficult to get heard in London than Scotland and Northern Ireland anyway. So, it's made their situation difficult. However, over time, I think things have changed. And the Welsh Government has moved from under the shadow of that result, if not escaping it completely, partly because of their increasing horror. And I know that's a strong word, but the more they look at the potential implications of leaving the single market for the Welsh economy, which is manufacturing heavy, for example, the more horrified they are by it. And also, the 2017 general election renewed Labour's mandate in Wales. In Wales, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister, effectively led the Labour campaign in the 2017 general election. They held off and indeed reversed the Conservative push. So that's given them added confidence. The second thing, which is clearly a factor, are the ambiguities of the British Labour Party's position on Brexit. I mean, Labour matters in Wales in a way that it doesn't anywhere else in the UK. This is the only place where the Labour Party wields, legislative and executive power in any serious way. And therefore, what Labour is saying matters. And you'll all be aware that we've had this painful kind of dance within the Labour Party, the tensions between the faction around the leadership and the bulk of the MPs. You've got Keir Starmer's very careful, crab-like movement around that issue. What's interesting is that the Welsh government has remained at the kind of leading edge of the Keir Starmer position without ever quite escaping the orbit. They've kept themselves within the orbit of Labour's position without ever going to a totally distinctive position, which has allowed them in turn to affect the Labour position. I think if they'd escaped the orbit, what they've been able to push, and you'll notice that Labour's stress on the devolution dimensions of Brexit has become firmer. It's now a red line issue, and that is no doubt partly due to the influence of the Welsh Labour government. The third thing, which is very, very important to note, is Wales's very painful history around the devolved dispensation. The history so far of Welsh devolution, and I can talk for hours about this, and the chair I need to escape the orbit of the chair in order to do that, but it's been a painful story of devolution dispensations which are meant to last for a generation and last for about 3 years on average till we move on to the next. And we had thought that we had reached the promised land of reserve powers model devolution, what you got in 99. We are getting it next April, okay? And the whole point about reserve powers was it was finally meant to introduce an element of stability to the constitutional dispensation. But of course, what is happening is with the withdrawal bill, it looks as if we're moving to something which looks very much like a conferred powers model of devolution. Again, we've had 3 Supreme Court cases in recent history which have underlined to us that the conferred powers model devolution is not where you particularly want to go. And those people who are interested in the Constitution, and the Welsh First Minister is definitely one of those people, sees what we've kind of worked for all these years being taken away at the last minute. And that has a big effect on how people like him view these things. That then relates to the fourth factor. There are 5 in total. The fourth factor then is that the Welsh First Minister has been arguing consistently now for years that we need extensive reform of the UK's territorial constitution, the kind of stuff that Michael was talking about at the end there. He's been arguing, and again, we can go into great detail about this, but he's arguing for what seems to me to be a kind of a species of confederalism. He calls it quasi-federalism. We can argue the toss, but what it means is that there should be equal status between the governments of the UK. That's what it means, basically, is that it's not a top-down relationship, but a relationship of equals. And clearly what's going on in the withdrawal bill is anything but that. And what we've seen from the UK is a turning back. There's no interest in that kind of thing. The behaviour towards the devolveds in the negotiations until very, very recently has been poor, arrogance matched only by incompetence. Mark Drakeford gave this wonderful presentation to the Brexit committee in the Commons where he said they were meant to have a meeting of the JMC that afternoon, and he said, we don't know which room this meeting is in, and they haven't sent us any papers. he said it's like St Faggan, which is a small village outside of, it's like St Faggan Community Council, was Mark Drakeford's view of how the UK government was dealing with the devolved. And, the Welsh government views itself as trying to be constructive, defending Welsh interests, whilst actually recognising, yes, the UK government has its legitimate policy concerns. They've tried to be constructive, and they felt that they've been rebuffed every time. So, standing side by side by Nicola Sturgeon is Carwyn Jones's way of saying, look, this is serious, This is, we are union. He regards himself as a unionist, but this isn't the union I'm signing up for, is his view. Final factor, sorry, I'm talking too long, but final factor, and this will interest and maybe surprise you. The final factor is that after the 2016 election, until fairly recently, there was a formal compact between the Welsh Labour Party and Plaid Cymru, the Nationalist Party, the third party in the Assembly, focusing on constitutional issues. Mainly focusing on Brexit. So both Welsh Labour and Plaid agreed to a formal process of working together on Brexit. And indeed, the first white paper that the Welsh Government published on Brexit in June of this year was a joint Labour-Plaid Cymru document, which I suspect were, that's probably quite hard to compute in Scotland, but Wales is a different country. And Plaid Cymru clearly had a big impact on that first document. And I think that moved the Welsh Government into a position where it is now able to cooperate with the Scottish Government, even though the compact between Plaid and Labour, for other reasons, has been brought to an end. So it's just a kind of a picture, just three quick things by way of conclusion, three very quick points. First of all, can the devolved governments force a change in the clauses 10 and 11 in particular in the withdrawal bill? I think quite possibly yes. It depends on the numbers in the House of Lords. The feeling in the Welsh Government is that the UK Government is starting to get worried, and they think that the UK Government is now engaging with Wales and Scotland in a more serious way than they have been before. So, it is possible that they can force a climb down. Clearly, the Welsh Government are working very hard on the House of Lords aspect of this. And if they win, that has potentially really big implications, not only for the withdrawal bill, but for the nature of the post-Brexit UK. Because there would be a different kind of negotiation if it's not the UK government saying, we'll have all of this and we'll give you bits as we decide. Secondly, this is just a kind of interesting question about where Labour ends up in all of this. The trajectory of what the Welsh Government is saying is clearly the Norway model. If the choice is now being clarified, if you like, between Canada and Norway as the two options, then Norway is the only option that Welsh Labour can sign up to. Will they do this once the withdrawal bill stuff is out of the way? Will they do that? Will Labour itself move there? Who knows? But I guess it matters more to us than most people. Final thought. Notwithstanding what happens to the clauses in the withdrawal bill, which the Welsh and Scottish governments find objectionable, I do wonder what will happen to the cooperation that has developed between Cardiff and Edinburgh. The Welsh government has an obvious interest in working with the Scottish government on this issue, because Carwyn Jones has made a series of interesting and thoughtful speeches about the future of the UK's constitution, which have been completely ignored. In fact, I suspect most of you have never heard of the existence of these speeches. Clearly, from his perspective, he will get more traction if there are more people engaging in this debate and if there are more people signing up to these ideas. Now, you may say, well, of course, the independent-seeking Scottish government has no interest in doing that. However, consider two things. First of all, given where we are, and this is speaking from a kind of Scottish government perspective, it's quite possible that Scotland ends up stuck in this union for the foreseeable future. So is there an interest in thinking about other ways of protecting and promoting Scotland's autonomy within a post-Brexit UK? And secondly, just thinking tactically, there may well be a tactical advantage moving towards another independence referendum of having worked out a kind of reasonable middle position endorsed by a self-identified unionist government elsewhere in the UK, if only for the UK government to reject it. That might actually be sensible politics. So we shall see. I mean, it's interesting that we haven't seen anything of this nature of this cooperation before, and I do wonder if it might be the start of something. Thank you.
Very good time. And I'm extremely grateful, both Michael and Richard, both being absolute professionals, you see, including bang on time, but giving us a very, very rich menu to choose. Michael describing some of the, or pointing at some of the very big constitutional, political, philosophical currents that we're facing about sovereignty, people, what is a demos, what is a polity, and how is this changing in Britain and indeed elsewhere in Europe. Richard bringing us bang up to date with some of the politics that affects our parties in all parts of the United Kingdom. I'm very sorry, for reasons that we all very much understand, have somebody here from Northern Ireland, from one of the parties there, well understand why at the moment, without a formed government or formed oppositions and clarity there, that would have been difficult, but it would have been very good to have had that side of the picture as well. I'm going to throw this over to the floor because there are so many issues now up in the air. I'm sure you will want to plunge in. If you don't, I shall. This is your chance, so please put your hands up.
As a broad generalisation, Whitehall had decided that Scotland should be allowed to go its own way and fought a guerrilla war over what should be in the Government of Wales Act. And I was interested in what Michael said about the view at the Westminster end, and I'd just like to ask whether you think that this is simply an unthought through technical approach, or whether you think that politically there is a movement at the centre in London to try and reverse the devolution settlements.
Thank you. We'll take another couple and we'll amalgamate them and get our speakers to answer them.
Thank you, Alison Elliott. I understand that the position that the Scottish Government is taking with regard to the withdrawal bill hinges on the existence of reserve powers in the Scottish devolution settlement. If Wales doesn't have reserve powers, what is the hinge, what is driving your opposition to the bill?
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Matt. I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you, Professor Keating, and diolch yn fawr, Professor Jones. You spoke about Wales and Scotland working together, and that was a really interesting point. What other areas do you think that the two governments can work together, potentially on getting greater devolved powers for Wales?
I don't think the people in London are engaged in any conspiracy to take powers back from Scotland. I don't think they care that much about us, frankly. It's not like Spain, where there was a grievance in Madrid every time something devolved to the peripheral nations and regions. I think it's just a failure to appreciate the nature of our constitution and a belief that this is a technical matter with a technical solution. It's the same with the Northern Ireland border, where it's seen as a purely technical matter. It's a deeply political matter, and there's an unwillingness to accept that. I was also frankly surprised that they proceeded this way in the withdrawal bill, because I was talking to a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I said, they won't be so clumsy and plaque-handed as to do that. There are cleverer ways of getting your hands on those powers than just re-reserving them. But I gave them too much credit for Machiavellian subtlety. They just said, so I was amazed, the bill just said, take it all back. And that gave the Scottish and Welsh governments a very easy and visible target. Without prejudice to the merits of the issue, it was actually good news for us because we're looking for test cases, and this one really illustrated the point. So of course, the Scots and Welsh had to say, hold on, there's an issue of principle here, and I think the UK government's beginning to realise that there's more to this than simply convenience. There are also untold problems in actually doing this in agriculture, for example. You're going to take agricultural policy back and then you're going to divulge bits of it, but if you've already decided you're going to have a UK agricultural policy, that preempts all kinds of things. There's an agricultural bill coming down the road that will leave very little to devolve. And if the UK is going to sign international trade agreements, again, that is going to preempt a lot of things you can do in agriculture and possibly other areas as well. All of that has got to be thought through. The UK government, in relation to repatriation of power, says we need to take these powers because we need to keep the UK single market. Well, there's a concept to get your mind around. We vaguely know what that means, but it's just never been spelled out, and it's highly contentious and very, very difficult. But for Whitehall, and they have to work in area, it's just a list of powers. So they've got a list of 111 powers. I think it's up to 113 now, bits and pieces that happen to have been legislated by Europe, rather than starting from the basic principle. What really do we need to keep in the UK? What is the UK going to look like after Brexit? What is important by way of common frameworks? They started at the wrong end, and that's partly because it's seen as just a purely technical problem, but it's also partly because this whole thing is being so rushed. Alison's question, I think, was directed more at Richard and Max. Well, yes, I think it is politically very interesting that the Welsh and Scottish governments are working together on this one. Again, it's because the UK government gave them such an easy target, because even a unionist could say, no, this is not the union as we think of it. I don't know about future developments. I think that will depend on the dynamics of this. Certainly there are differences between the Scottish and Welsh governments about the frameworks for policy that are going to follow devolution. They both say the frameworks must be based on voluntary cooperation and not re-centralisation. But the Welsh government's looking towards joint policy making, and the Scottish government's looking at joint frameworks that set parameters within which there'll be more autonomous policy making. So there are important differences there, even though they've caught on the same constitutional point.
Thank you. Richard, a lot of the Welsh questions were directed at you, but you might also like to comment on the first more constitutional one.
Yes, I think the withdrawal bill just looks like not quite a panic measure, but it's the kitchen sink is in there, isn't it? Every power you might possibly need for every circumstance. So all of these Henry VIII powers, and it looks like a fix which looks very clever from the centre if you're not interested in devolution. But I don't believe that it was a plot. However, they were warned time and again that going down this route would lead to problems. I mean, the Welsh government, I'm repeating a point I made earlier, view themselves as good unionists. So they view themselves as trying to work constructively, and I know that the territorial officers in Whitehall were very well aware of the sensitivities, and I suspect were advising that this wasn't the way to go, and yet they were roundly ignored. And indeed, we had the you'll all be aware that the JMC, which was supposed to be meeting monthly,
This is Joint
Ministerial Council, which was meant to be focusing on this, met in, was it January, and then didn't meet again until September. And the January meeting was a farce, according to participants, whereas the September one was very much more business-like. And certainly the Welsh view is, well, they're starting to get worried about the numbers in the House of Lords. They view it very much as in kind of power politics terms, if you like. So, I don't think it was conspiracy. However, they were warned, and they've just carried on blithely. The question, I think it was from Alison, about reserve powers. Well, we are in transition from conferred powers to reserve powers. It's on the statute book, and they're coming in April, and that's and I didn't go into we're now on our second conferred powers model. We tried it several ways, and so the idea was that this was going to bring stability. This has been the end. Well, it's not the end point, but it's a culmination of a particular period of time and commissions and all-party agreements and so on and so forth. So the idea that this is being taken away, and that we know that a conferred powers model is unstable. I mean, we've had, the first piece of legislation that the Welsh government tried to pass using the second version of conferred powers ended up in the Supreme Court. This is a system which we know has got huge problems, and so that's why this is a particular issue. And then finally, I mean, the question from Matt about cooperative working. There has been cooperative working in particular policy areas. Agriculture is an area where Welsh ministers and Scottish ministers are often adopting similar positions against the UK, effectively the English minister. So there has always been cooperation in different areas at different times, but we've never seen this extent of cooperation. And the fact that a Labour government is so comfortable in cooperating with an SNP administration on this stuff, and that it's such an easy and that it is remarkable to see these people at close quarters. We had an event in Brussels fairly recently with Mark Drakeford and Mike Russell and their teams, and it was this is a very, very easy relationship. But I do think this is more speculative, but you've always got the sense in the past that the Scottish government officials, who are really good in this field, but view themselves as they viewed themselves as having a different set of problems, if you like, than the Welsh. Well, that's very interesting, but where we are far advanced. But I think they are now taking more of an interest in the stuff that Carwyn Jones has been saying about the constitution of the UK. I mean, the Welsh government is the only place in the UK where you've actually had people trying to think about a different model for the UK. Now, whether they've got any good answers, that's a different question. But they've been thinking hard about it for years. And I think that the Scottish government is now taking more notice of that. Where that goes to, I don't know. I think a lot depends, as Michael said, on the way the politics plays out moving forward.
Very interesting. Did you want to comment again on that? I'm about to take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Leslie. I'd like to ask about immigration, because the problem in Scotland, which is driving part of the Scottish government's desire for a differentiated immigration solution in the light of what is effectively a falling Indigenous birth rate, an ageing population, a recognition that Scotland's population as a whole would be falling were it not for immigration. I would love to hear a Welsh perspective on that, and I would like to hear whether Michael thinks there's any chance of arriving at some kind of differentiated immigration policy. It's been blocked. We've been told we need an immigration policy that works for all the UK. I'm not sure there is one.
Thank you. Yeah, Paul Grice. To what extent do you think we need to resolve the question of sovereignty, for example, to underpin the operation of common frameworks and even international trade deals? Or do you think the wiser course is to maintain the current ambiguity?
Can I just clarify? You're talking about sovereignty inside the United Kingdom, sovereignty between the United Kingdom and the rest of the world. Sorry, inside the British.
Principally the former. Principally the former.
Right, the British peoples. And so.
Thank you. Bill Roger, also European Movement in Scotland. I'd like to ask, if I may, both speakers about the Irish connection. Our chairs commented on the fact they're absent here. They are, of course, absent in the bigger discussion, really, which is regrettable. But there are connections, there are discussions going on, and one of the reasons for asking is my own organisation is hosting a conference in the next couple of weeks with the European Movement Ireland. So how does that play into this? Because, and I'd like to understand a bit more Michael, I thought it was maybe a throwaway remark about your comment about the Irish government needing to be consulted on changes as far as the the Northern Irish position is concerned. Just how deeply does that go? And so can I really push my luck and just ask Richard Wynne-Jones to comment on the theory that the reason that Wales voted 52-48 the wrong way, in my opinion, to what was simply because BBC Wales ran out of funds after an exhausted Assembly campaign, and what lessons does that have then for media in both devolved administrations?
I should just repeat, we've got a question about immigration, potential for differentiated approaches in different parts of the United Kingdom, a question about sovereignty and how sovereignty and nations might develop among the peoples in the United Kingdom, and then one about the Irish connection, and particularly with reference to Wales, but I'm sure Scotland is also of interest here. Richard.
There's lots there, and apologies if I don't remember every element of every question. On immigration, so traditionally, Scotland had a lower growth rate in terms of population. Wales was very similar to England. The most recent data I've seen, and it's very, very recent, and I'm not an expert on this, but is that the Welsh growth rate is also now slowing below England, and that was I saw that in the context of discussion over income tax devolution, because the day after Brexit, if it happens is the day that we get income tax powers. Brilliant timing. And the Welsh government has also been arguing for a differentiated. It published quite an extensive paper on what they call fair movement of people, but that's not something that they expect to get much traction on. They don't think that they've got much leverage around that. Paul's question on sovereignty, I think, is fascinating, and I think the response would be the problem. In a sense, it would be nice to be able to leave it ambiguous. However, the withdrawal bill is completely unambiguous in its assumptions, and that's where you've got this response and reaction from the Welsh government around this, is that is such a strong centralising move, not only in terms of the legislation, but the way that the UK government has conducted itself around that legislation, that they view as an absolute reassertion of parliamentary sovereignty in its crudest way, which is precisely why they're fighting it so hard. On Bill's question, Bill, a couple of questions for Bill. First of all, it's just worth making the point, because most people are not aware of this, even in Wales, so I doubt it's many people at all in Scotland have heard about this. The second busiest port in the UK in terms of lorry traffic is Holyhead. 1,000 lorries a day go through Holyhead. If you've ever been to Holyhead, Holyhead is on an island, off an island. There is literally no space unless there's a volcano eruption between now and Brexit Day to actually park anything. It's one of these roll on, roll off ferry ports. The UK government has no plans. They have confirmed that they are thinking about it, but there are currently no plans. It's like Dover. They've got no idea. So it's a really major issue, and that's my part of the world. So it's a really major issue at home, and the UK government is just not engaging, and it's pretty desperate. Not least because that's one of the poorest parts of Western Europe up there. So that port, it actually makes more sense to take things through Liverpool, because there is an area in the port there. So it's just disastrous. The media stuff, I could talk again at length about the referendum vote in Wales and what happened, but certainly part of the story of all of this is Cameron's disastrous decision to ignore the entreaties of the First Ministers of Wales, Scotland, and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, and the Electoral Commission, and to hold the referendum in the immediate aftermath of the devolved elections, because that meant there wasn't a campaign in Wales. There just wasn't a campaign in Wales, and the BBC had run out of money, and they did do one programme on the referendum on BBC Wales right at the end, and it was terrible. So there was just no framing of this in terms of the consequences for Wales, and that is, it's not, that doesn't explain the results, in its entirety by a long, long way, but it is certainly part of the equation, and of course there are problems with that situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Andrew's question about immigration. Yes, I think it is perfectly possible to have a differentiated immigration policy, or at least right-to-work policy. They're not quite the same thing, but it's something similar to the free movement policy within the European Union, within the UK. Other countries do it. The Home Office has set its face against it. It's totally obsessed with this idea of control and borders. We come across it. I got an email the other day from an Irish colleague saying, I'm going up to the north to examine a PhD thesis, and I have to show my passport. I said, we have to do this. When I go from Edinburgh to Glasgow to examine a thesis, I have to show to prove I'm entitled to work in the United Kingdom. I'm a British citizen working at a British university. So we've got a particular obsession about this, and it's a particular Home Office obsession about that. We know that these things are controlled not at the physical border, but at the place of work in any case. Yes, and I thought that was a concession that the UK government might even make, because there are very good economic and social arguments for it, and the situation in Scotland and Wales is objectively different from the situation in parts of England. You could say something similar about London as well, by the way. Paul's question, do we need to resolve the question of sovereignty? No, we don't. I think that is an issue that is often best avoided, because if you keep on peeling away the layers of the onion to try and find the sovereignty in the middle of it, there's nothing left there. It's something that you've got to put together. It's constructed. It's a set of relationships. It's not a thing you have. It is an element linking actors within a political system. And this conceit that it's a thing that you have, we blame Blackstone and Dicey and some of the English jurists for it. But it's at best a claim. It's never more than a claim. And the claim is always contested. Now, rather than just saying, let's be fuzzy about it, we can actually reason about sovereignty in a different way. And I've always been inspired by the work of the late Neil McCormick, a professor at Edinburgh, and whose father, of course, was the one who took the famous case to the Court of Session, McCormick versus the Lord Advocate, which said that parliamentary sovereignty doesn't apply in Scotland. And then everybody forgot about it for 50 years and rediscovered that might be an important issue. And it's not a surprise that there are particular places in Europe where that notion, what Neil used to call post-sovereignty, but which is a term that I took up and used, but it's not new. There are places in Europe where sovereignty was never resolved for historical reasons. One is Scotland, because neither the Scottish Parliament nor the monarchy was able to make effective the pretensions that the English Crown and Parliament had to absolute sovereignty. So how could we, this was the McCormick reasoning, how could we have transmitted that to the new Parliament of the United Kingdom? So that idea has always been around. It's been around in the Basque Country as a central part of their doctrine. Sabino Arana went crazy in the middle of the 20th century and said we were a nation state. They went. They were part of a compound monarchy. Similarly in Catalonia. Recently they've forgotten about that in the last few months. But those ideas are deeply rooted. And so that's why in Scotland the notion of talking about sovereignty at multiple levels isn't something that people find odd. It's something that we've done for 300 years. And it's something that then is taken up as part of the European architecture. So I think we can make rigorous arguments about sovereignty that don't depend on having sovereignty lodged in just one place. And Bill, on the Irish connection, I could go on all night, because I'm based in Dublin at the moment. I'm going back there tomorrow morning. But yes, the Irish government has a locus in the Northern Ireland settlement. Legally, it's on rather narrow grounds, that parts of the settlement are embedded in an international treaty deposited at the United Nations, but the broader understanding of it was that the basis of the settlement is get the two communities together in Northern Ireland and get the two sovereign states together. There, I've used the word sovereign. Two states claiming sovereignty, accepting that neither of them really has a monopoly of sovereignty in that place, and they've got to share it. That was the basis. So that, as far as I'm concerned, it is a constitutional convention. And the Irish government feel that they've really been they've been let down on that count because the decision was taken unilaterally. Decisions were taken that affect the bilateral relationship between Ireland and the UK, the kind of trade relationship that Richard was talking about, and travel routes and so on. But also the decisions were taken that affect Northern Ireland unilaterally, rather than in the kind of multilateral frameworks within which Northern Ireland has been discussed over the last 20 years or so, particularly in relation to this border question. And we had a meeting in Dublin just after the referendum. Richard and I were both there, talking to Irish people. By chance, it was just a week after the referendum, and the Irish position was, well, we've got to stay close to the Brits because we really need them. Nowadays, you go there and they're saying, well, look, you know, we're one of the 27. There's been that shift in consciousness and shift in strategy. We're with the 27. We want to open up all channels we can with the United Kingdom and keep what but basically, we're on the other side, and this is your problem. You've created this problem, and you've got to resolve it. Now, the Irish government, again, with the meeting we had yesterday, the Irish consul came along and said what I've heard several times. We have a solution. We all stay in the customs union and the single market. That's our solution. If you've got a better one, tell us, and we'll discuss it. But they haven't got a better one. And there's frankly a lot of empty talk about the border. These, what I call placeholding terms that are put there in text until you've got an answer to the question, but they're stuck there. It's like one of these old poems where somebody couldn't find the rhyme, and it goes into publication, and the placeholder is still there. Frictionless border, no borders of the past, no physical infrastructure, which really don't mean anything, and we're getting very, very close. So it's not surprising the Irish have made it absolutely clear that in next month's summit they want some progress on that, because they've had no progress whatsoever. And the consequences for the peace agreement of closing that border, I don't mean just the physical border, I mean closing it by having different systems of regulation or customs. And it doesn't matter whether the customs posts are 20 miles away from the border. Having that hard border, even if it's a virtual one, will be absolutely catastrophic, both for the economy of Ireland and the idea of an Irish economic space, but also for community relations within Northern Ireland, because the two communities did vote in radically different ways on Brexit. That breach has been reopened at a time when the institutions in Northern Ireland are extremely fragile and collapsed a few months ago, and probably won't be put back on the together again within the next few months. So this is really important, and it's really, really urgent. But there's no solution. There's no constructive solution out there, other than just meaningless words.
Another round of questions. 1, 2, 3, and there's more at the back that we'll catch later. Thanks.
I wanted to ask what the indications were about the way the populations in these various places are changing their views, if indeed they are changing them. I mean, we know that in the referendum, Scotland voted by a comfortable majority to remain in the European Union. We also know that Wales voted to come out, which was bizarre in a way, because actually the figures that the David Hume Institute has produced shows that Wales actually gets a net benefit financially from the European Union, unlike the rest of the UK, where we all make various contributions. In Scotland, we pay, I think, £74 a year or something per head. In England, it's 111 or 117. In Northern Ireland, it's 31. But Wales gets a plus. And that, I don't know, I wonder how the Welsh people actually, whether they knew that. I would have thought it would have affected the result of it. Anyhow, is the Welsh public opinion moving on this issue? Are they now more inclined, would they be more inclined to vote Remain if there was another referendum? In which case, that, I suppose, adds strength to the Welsh government's view that at least we should remain in the single market. As for Northern Ireland, the position of the then Northern Ireland Secretary of State struck me as quite extraordinary, because knowing the implications of instituting a border, she voted for leave. I mean, that seems absolutely criminal to me. But anyhow, that was the position. The DUP are voted to leave, but Northern Ireland as a whole voted to stay in. So what indications do we have about how public opinion is changing on these issues?
Thank you.
Could I prevail upon you, constitutional anarchs, to comment on the whole structure of devolved powers as they're emerging in the UK? My degree was in computer science. I'm a logical sort of person. But the Northern Ireland settlement and the Welsh settlement and the Scottish settlements are all different. And now we've got mayors in Liverpool and Manchester and London and Cambridge, I think, and they're all different. And is there any sort of plan here, or are we piloting all these systems to finally work out one that works and then we're going to apply it?
Good question. One down here.
I'm Laura Dunlop from the trustee of the Institute. I wanted to go back to the 111 list, which is described as a list of areas in which common frameworks may be required. I wondered if either of the speakers knows any more about the circumstances in which that list emerged. More particularly, in the media, the list is usually presented as a list of areas which are now dealt with in Brussels. But the reality is actually that it's a mishmash of areas which are currently dealt with in Brussels for the most part, but also areas which are currently reserved and areas which are currently devolved, and where the influence of Brussels is minimal. And probably the leading example of that is land use, which features on the list as an item in its own right. So is there further information about what that list is supposed to be for?
Right, some good questions there. Who shall start? Michael.
Okay, Gavin's question was about public opinion. Public opinion seems to have challenged very little, but we don't really know how people make the trade-offs amongst the options that are there. If you just ask people, then it's about 50-50 still, which it was at the referendum across the UK. Maybe it's 51 for Remain, but it would be very narrow. And if there was another campaign, another referendum, it would all depend on the campaign. There's some work that's done both in surveys and in focus groups to ask people to make the trade-offs. And these overwhelmingly show support for the softest possible form of Brexit, and that people are concerned about migration, but they'll even trade that off against access to the single market. And that should provide the politicians with some basis for saying, well, people want something like the single market. They may not use the term single market, but you put it to them about trade and what the implications are. It just seems to me that none of the political leaders have picked up on that at all. As far as the various parts of the United Kingdom are concerned, again, I'll leave Wales to Richard. In Scotland, it's complicated by the overlaying of independence, union, and Remain, leave. And they don't map onto each other very clearly at all, because we have a third of the yes to independence people voting leave, which is not the cue they're getting from the Independence Party. So what kind of package could you make out of that? Again, the SNP have caused a degree of confusion because everybody knows they're in favour of independence, but they had, for reasonable, perfectly understandable reasons, a menu of about 5 choices that they ran through very, very quickly. And so people don't understand what is their position, what they're arguing for now. Independence is certainly not selling. Support for independence is exactly where it was at the referendum, within the margin of error. That is between about 43 and 48%. That hasn't changed. There's almost no correlation between support for independence and support for leave or Remain in the European Union. There's always been a strong correlation between support for forms of stronger devolution and pro-Europeanism. But once it comes to independence, the sovereignty experience, it's very difficult. We can say, to come back to Paul's sovereignty question, that if you put all this together, I'm trying to do this, and I'm going to have another go through this in the next few months, that if you put all the people in Scotland together who believe that sovereignty should be in one place, that is, yes to independence outside Europe, yes to leaving Europe and take all the powers back to Westminster, I can't get more than 20% of people in Scotland that would believe in that. The overwhelming reading of the Scottish data is people are quite happy with having power lodged at multiple levels. It's not a problem. That's a problem that's constrained by certain people. It's not actually a problem. But the political parties are not there, because the political parties haven't mapped onto that and offered the electors any clear choices. On the economic rationale, well, we know that people didn't vote on the basis of economic calculation. That's quite clear. And the DUP are conflicted. The party is divided at the moment, I think, between the Belfast leadership and the Westminster MPs, who are much more pro-Brexit. The DUP likes Brexit because they like the idea of having a border, because their raison d'etre is to keep a border, but they don't want a hard border. And they simply haven't worked that out. Their farmers, I was talking to their farmers leaders the farming union, who understand this very well. They're saying, our members just don't understand. You can't have your cake and eat it. We're trying to communicate that to them. And then, of course, in Northern Ireland, the collapse of the institutions mean that Northern Ireland is not at the table there. There are bilateral talks with the parties, civil servants come to it, but they're not at the table, and that makes a huge difference to trying to get any sense about the Northern Ireland border. Do we need an overall plan for the United Kingdom? No. It's a pipe dream. And if we'd waited to get an overall plan, we'd never have had devolution, because we've been talking about it since Gladstone's day in the 1880s. And I lived a long time in Canada, and they've never got the constitution reformed because they had to get everything on the agenda at the same time instead of proceeding sequentially. So they said, Quebec's the first thing, but don't worry, we'll sort out. No, you've got to sort us out now, the West, and all the rest of it. So I think we went about it the right way. Let's start with Scotland. Wales, we have to address. They did address Wales, not very wholeheartedly, kind of tacked on behind Scotland. That was the reality of it. But the Welsh institutions have since developed and taken on a life of their own. Northern Ireland happened at the same time, purely by coincidence. It wasn't because it was part of the same plan. There's a lot of talk now in progressive circles in London about having a citizens' convention to sort out the constitution of the United Kingdom. Only kind of Islington, London sort of places would you think that we should stop what we're doing now and have a citizens' convention and dig down to the roots of the constitution, because all you do is reveal what you disagree about. We don't share our view about where sovereignty comes from. So why bother spending your time talking about it? And I say to them, the urgency at the moment is getting the two communities in Northern Ireland to agree, let alone getting them to agree with the Scots and the Welsh and the English. And as Richard has shown in his research, the English debate hasn't really reached a point where there's a clear view there to be articulated. But at some point that might be necessary. At some point it might be appropriate to say, let's see how it comes together now. And even if we can't stop the world moving while we sort it out and then get it spinning again, it's very important when we take these little moves at the moment to realize the long-term implications. And that's something else we're looking at in our big project of this. Some things that may be presented as quite innocent turn out to set precedents, creating facts on the ground. The sequencing of events is critical. You do something now, that then affects the next move in the game. So that kind of intelligence is important, even if we don't have an overall blueprint. Laura, how did this list, I don't know, but I gather they do what they usually do in the UK government in relation to devolution. They go around all the departments, they give us something. Come on, guys, you got to give us something. Go around again, and they get this grab bag and they put it there, and this is what they did with Calman and the Smith Commission. Give us something. Okay, you can have licensing of air rifles because we don't care about that. Put that in the bag. This is the way Whitehall treats devolution most of the time, and it doesn't surprise me that they got things mixed up. Land use, I think, came because of Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland farmers are very worried about the Conacher system that they have there. It's part of their land holding, and there's a freehold system as well, and it's not clear whether that is devolved or reserved. So put that in the bag there. There's no logic to it. And as I was arguing, the logical place might be to say, what are the basic principles here? What is the UK internal market? They stopped talking about single market because that was a misleading analogy. Talk about the and therefore derive some kind of principle. Instead, they start at the other end and got a list of things that makes no sense whatever in relation to the big issues that we're talking about. But this is all being done in such a hurry, you can understand why that happens.
I wish that sounded less plausible. Richard.
Gavin's question, well, Gavin's statement that Wales was a net beneficiary is indeed correct. The evidence suggests that people in the areas which were the beneficiary areas, and they are some of the poorest areas in Western Europe. When you leave the valleys, it's 1,000 kilometers before you get to the next poorest area. It's in Czech Republic. But people didn't believe that the money was making any difference, or they didn't even believe it was being spent. Although, but part of the issue here is that the referendum vote, at least on the basis of the work that I've been conducting with colleagues here in Edinburgh, actually, identity was such an important part of what was going on. And in England, it's very, very clear that the relationship was the more exclusively British you were, the more pro-European you were, the more exclusively English you were, the more overwhelmingly anti you were. In Wales, it's very clear that the more, those who were strongly Welsh voted Remain. Those who were in Scotland, it's also true that those people who were strongly Scottish without British identity tended to vote Remain. The strong, but actually, and then what's interesting is that in Scotland and in Wales, Britishness is associated with anti-European sentiment, whereas in England, Britishness on its own tends to be pro-European. So this is Michael's point about identities meaning different things in different parts of Britain. So the point about this identity, if it is about identity, and I'm convinced by my own work on this, then nothing has shifted so far in the story. So we shouldn't be surprised that there hasn't been a big shift. I think it may well come. I genuinely do think that it may well come as the implications become clearer. Where it goes, however, I think there will be a response. I wouldn't necessarily assume that response is the response that you would like to see, Gavin. So I'm not surprised. It hasn't moved, and I'm not surprised. On the gentleman at the back was saying is that, there's clearly not a master plan, or if it is, God help us all. I mean, one of the frustrating things about all of this is that there's never any learning lessons either. We seem to be doomed to repeat mistakes. I mean, I mentioned Wales just having had the conferred powers model. We were given in the last devolution dispensation the model that was the Scotland Act 1978 model, which the UK government then decided wasn't fit for purpose in the Scotland Act 1998. But we had to prove that it wasn't fit for purpose by trying it out in Wales. And the stuff going on around English, the models of governance there take incoherence to a kind of whole new level, and that is deeply depressing. But there genuinely seems to be very little learning. So in Wales, we are now just embarking on a big debate about devolving justice and establishing a legal jurisdiction, and there is a kind of an internal process. And the former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Lord John Thomas, he's now going to chair a commission on that starting next month. So that there's a kind of debate internal in Wales, which nobody outside of Wales takes any notice of, but we get on with it. But in terms of the UK as a whole, no, there's nothing at all. And and I absolutely agree with Michael. Carwyn Jones has been calling for a UK constitutional convention. We've got constitutional convention envy in Wales. We've decided that yours was a really, great thing, and if only we'd had one ourselves. But it just ignores the context. And Michael is right; it would be a total waste of time. So we're just going to get on with it, I think, and God knows what the English are going to do.
We need to wind up, but I'm very conscious that there are just two people who have been waiting, and I would like just to ask them, but I'm going to have to ask our speakers to be incredibly concise in their answers. But that lady there and you.
Thank you very much. I'm Carol Jefferson Davis from Thinking Without Borders, which is the David Hume group down in his homeland of Churnside. In the midst of all the shenanigans and politicking on both sides of the water in Europe and here, we do hear murmurings that Brexit might just not ultimately happen, either by persuasion or by decision or by default. Could I have your quick take on the realities or potential realities and consequences of that in this ghastly mess that we find ourselves in? Thank you.
Great question. 30 seconds each, but let's just have the last question.
Going back to the question of migration and your discussions with people in various organisations, could you tell me where the politicians and other people think actually vegetables are going to be grown and fruit is going to be harvested and animals are going to go to slaughterhouses? 80% of the staff in Scottish slaughterhouses are not British. If, therefore, they're not able to work here on either permanent visa or seasonal permit, the question, defence of the realm as a first responsibility, but actually, surely ensuring food growth, distribution, security is also a duty of government. So how the hell are they going to do it?
I'm afraid it will happen, and it's going to be Suez times 100 in terms of its traumatic effect. I see no realistic way of avoiding it. The final question, that was a reality-based question, wasn't it? And that's clearly very, very far away from where we are in the political debate at the moment. You know, you're absolutely right. It should be a question at the forefront of the agenda, but I'm not sure that it is, unfortunately.
Yes, Caroline, Brexit might not happen. I think public opinion could accept Brexit not happening. All the evidence suggests if that was put to them, they could get their minds around it. We had a better informed debate. But the parliamentary arithmetic and the party system just doesn't match itself to that. We just don't have parties in Westminster at the moment reflecting the division of opinion in the country and therefore able to mobilize different majorities should that be what the people in the country want, which is a very curious thing to end up in as a result of a referendum that was supposed to produce a clear outcome, but there we are. And on migration, well, the idea seems to be we'll reduce migration. Well, that doesn't include the fruit pickers and the doctors or the nurses or the scientists or the finance people or the technician or the students, but everybody else is going to be kept up. Right? That's the fact. And again, they're saying in relation to these surveys that are done, focus groups that are done, if you put that to people, if you don't put them an abstract question about are there too many foreigners coming here, but ask questions right precisely about the economic needs of the country, they will accept that. The electorate are not stupid. They do accept logical arguments if it's put to them. It's just that they've not been offered that kind of information in the right way.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. I've got a lot of people to thank, all who made my life very easy because we've had such very good questions from the floor that there is really time for me to do anything at all other than thank you to you as excellent audience, but a huge thanks to both of our speakers. I think the degree of interest and specificity in their answers to your very specific questions has been quite outstanding. I have been very pleased to have sat here listening to them, very tempted to chip in myself, but recognizing that actually the answers you were getting from them were of quality that I needed to